I suppose that this is every gardener's dream. An old thatched cottage deep in the heart of the country, roses round the door and surrounded by a glorious jumble of old-fashioned flowers. It's the image we all have of the traditional English cottage garden, portrayed on a million chocolate box tops and envied by gardeners all over the world. There's a heady romance about a garden like this, and a feeling that here you could recapture all that's best of the old country ways of times long past. But if you think that a rose-covered, thatched cottage in the country is essential for a good cottage garden, just take a look at this. A modern house in modern materials with a decidedly 20th century look. And yet it's proof positive that by a bit of clever gardening you can recreate that traditional rural feel and bring a breath of fresh country air into your life. In this garden, I'll swear I can hear the clip-clop of hooves as the ploughman wends his weary way. This country has a long and rich tradition of cottage gardening. Over the next 6 programmes, I shall be building 2 very different cottage gardens at Barnsdale. To help me build them, I've been visiting some of the very best gardens around the country and talking to their gardeners, in order to find inspiration and ideas I can use in my garden and you can use in yours.
The cottage tulips as such are the longest lasting of any. I'm very fond of the lily flowered, but they don't exist for very long. The cottage tulips will go on quite for a long time, and so I'd never dig them up. I leave them all in the soil and they take their chance.
Yes, I've got slugs here. I get in the potatoes, you see, if I don't look after them.
So what do you do?
Well, when I plant the potatoes, look, I put the farmyard manure in, then the potato, then I cover it with soot. Soot what I get out the chimney, you know, when I sweep a chimney.
Yeah. And does that keep them away?
Yes. I took them potatoes up, I ain't had one slug eating one.
What we do is we cut off these shoots, and you can see here that this was actually 10 foot or so long. People don't like this because they assume that you're cutting off next year's flowering growth. But in reality, what you're doing is you're encouraging this very twiggy sort of growth. And then you get the whole architecture of the arch, and all the energy of the rose goes into these little flowers.
Gardeners like these are using their ingenuity and gardening skills just as their ancestors did. The tradition carries on, even if the setting today can be somewhat different. Far from the traditional thatch and wattle and daub, this is the kind of house that most of us live in these days, and this is the kind of garden that we inherit. We're generally faced with all the problems the old cottage gardeners had to conquer. Little space, little time, and above all, not a lot of money. But no matter, they managed to create this kind of paradise, and so, with a little hard work and imagination, can you. But first, it helps to learn the lessons of that evolutionary process. In the 14th century, life for the rural poor was hard. Their tiny cottages would have had very often leaky thatched roofs, and depending on the area you were in, if you were lucky you might have had a flint or a stone wall, but very often they were just wattle and daub. And they were very draughty places indeed. Inside, just one main room where the whole family lived and ate on very rudimentary furniture. No glass in the windows, of course, just a flap to pull down when it got really cold, and the floor is just beaten earth. In the centre was a fireplace, but no chimney. The smoke would have simply gone up through a hole in the gable end. So the inhabitants would have smelt like freshly smoked kippers. There might have been a wattle and daub partition to section off the area where they slept and cooked. In the winter, certainly, they would have shared their living space with their precious animals, because the medieval poor depended greatly upon this old girl. Now, Petronella here is in fact very much like a medieval breed. Notice the long snout, which is used for snuffling, because she certainly would have been allowed to roam in the woodlands to root out acorns and other wild food. And they used to grow them big in those days too, because the fat was used for all kinds of things, from waterproofing, greasing their primitive implements, and of course for making candles, which was their only illumination in their gloomy cottages. And it was a very important part of their diet. But of course, that was supplemented with vegetables and herbs that they grew in their gardens. The 14th century cottage was at the Weald and Downland Open Air Museum near Chichester, and there I met Bob Holman, who's their expert on medieval horticulture.
Well, they had quite a wide range of vegetables, really. Amongst these were coleworts, which are the forerunners of our cabbages. They had onions, they had garlic, they had skirrets, alexanders. A limited amount of root crops, really, very, very few of these. They came later. There's quite a lot of edible weeds like sow thistles, dandelions, fat hen, good King Henry.
And did they grow things to brighten their lives in the way of flowers?
Not very many flowers, no. Probably the herbs were the brightest things in the garden. Having said that, they grew a lot of pot marigolds.
Were they called that because they were grown in a pot or because they were for the pot?
They were for the pot, really.
Oh, really?
They ate the leaf, of course. The petals were used directly to put into wounds. They mixed the petals with tallow and beeswax and animal fats to make a healing cream. And so it was quite an important flower to them, really.
This was the real beginning of the cottage garden. These days, you're very likely to find a smart car parked outside the old cottage, ready to whisk the owner off to work in the town. But here and there are a few of the genuine article left. Their gardening hardly changed over hundreds of years. When I visited George Flatt in his old cottage deep in the Suffolk countryside, I started by asking him how long he'd lived there.
72 years.
72 years. So how old are you?
87. 13 when I left school.
Yeah.
1919. I worked on the land, agricultural work. I started with in the yards, you know, just a boy like in the yards and do a little few odd jobs about. They put me onto the horses. They said they thought they'd like me to use the horses, you see, go to plough and do all that sort of work. Yeah. And then I had several years at that, you see. Well, then they done away with the horses, didn't they? So I had to go on a tractor. My father died in 1930. And that's when I took the garden over, you see, after my father died in 1930. So I've been farming this land since 1930, you see, myself.
Now, when you were working on the horses, that's hard work, isn't it?
Well, yes, yes.
So how'd you get your digging done then?
Well, that's what I had people say. How did I do it then? I said, well, I have been a digging here overnight in the moonlight.
Really?
The parish lantern, they used to call it years ago.
And I suppose that really was to feed your family in those days.
Well, yes, yes.
Did you learn about gardening?
No, it all come to only what my father learnt me, you see.
Yeah.
He always told me to dig with a spade. I always remember that.
Yeah.
So I want to dig with a spade, boy, he said.
George Flatt's self-taught and instinctive gardening should reassure any novice that it doesn't have to be that scientific or mysterious. He was given a buddleia for his 80th birthday, and this year he decided to propagate it.
I stuck some pieces in, you know, and I'm shooting nicely now, so I have some more.
So did you just stick those in the ground?
That's right, yeah. I pruned it, you see, and then I stuck them pieces in.
Yeah. So what will you do with those?
Well, somebody will have them, you see. I'll give them away.
That's good, yeah.
I might save one to myself, you see.
You grow all your flowers and things in with the vegetables, don't you? You don't really worry too much about mixing them up.
Oh, no. No, as I say, a lot of them flowers keep coming every year.
Do they?
Yeah. Them poppies, look, I seed. I don't plant them, I seed, and they come up every year.
Do you consider yourself to be a bit of an artist?
No, I don't really. No, I just come to me, you know.
There are few gardeners who could not learn something from George Flatt, but many people today will want their cottage gardens brimming less with vegetables and more with flowers. For them and me, 84-year-old Hannah Hutchinson is another extraordinary inspiration.
My father was a very keen gardener, so it's in the genes, as you might say. I did a training at Reading University in dairying and agriculture, and my first job was a school where there was a very intelligent woman gardener. And when I'd finished with my cows and rabbits, etc., I used to help her, and that's how I really became inspired, about 1935. We moved here in 1966. There wasn't a garden, it was a field with 2 old apple trees, and I got the local farmer to come in and plough the lot up. And I didn't draw extensive maps and plans, it just evolved.
And what about planting schemes? I mean, do you stick to a certain scheme?
No, I'm rather haphazard, really. I do think about colour and contrasting colours, but nature is very amazing, and you get some marvellous effects without doing anything. It just does it for you.
You try to keep a continuity of flowers
The great thing is one thing goes over to be followed immediately by something else, and the great idea is to have as much colour as possible. I'm very keen on colour.
I have to confess, I've been going around the garden taking notes about the plants that you grow so I can grow them in my own garden.
Good.
And you've got some good old cottage garden favourites there, like Love in a Mist. Now, that's an annual, isn't it? So do you sow it every year?
No, I let it just sow itself where it stands, and I always get very good results. In fact, I have to pull up quite a lot of it.
Do you? Yeah.
Yes, but there's quite a number of plants that I do that with. Poppies, foxgloves, forget-me-nots.
Well, you've got lots of lovely poppies around. Do you find that they cross with each other to produce new colours?
Yes, they do tend to. I think it's the bees. It's just like so many of the flowers, they get crossed by the bees, and you get some exciting things.
It certainly happens with the opium poppies, doesn't it? Which you've also got.
Yes. Those are very strong and very lusty.
Just look at that. Just
Yes,
come
he's
on the
wonderful.
table.
Yes,
Isn't he
look,
nice? Yeah.
He's come for his shortbread.
Isn't that wonderful? Now, Hannah, as you come through your gate, the first thing that really hits you in the eye is a wonderful stand of delphiniums. Where do they come from?
I grow them from seed, from the Delphinium Society seed every year. And I do buy in about 3 plants every year from a very good firm to keep up the standard.
Are they difficult to raise from seed?
No, very simple, and they're very hardy. The one thing is the trouble of snails and slugs, and this is why people say they can't grow delphiniums, because they're not alert to the fact that they're eaten out of all existence within a few minutes.
And how do you stop that?
Well, I regret to tell you, I use slug pellets, eggshell and grit.
Yes.
And I do a lot in the autumn and a great deal in the spring. That's the most vulnerable time.
When the plants are just
when they're
coming
just
through.
emerging, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
You've got some beautiful colours there. Are
Yes.
there some specific varieties?
Yes, they are. There's one called Black Knight, and there's another, Lord Butler's, a very light blue one, which is a sheer delight.
It really is a lovely variety too, isn't
Yes,
it?
it is. It's very vigorous.
But of course, the others, if you've raised them from seed, don't actually have names.
No, they don't. No, that's right, no.
And near to those, and almost equalling them in height and stature, are some campanulas.
Oh yes, now that's Campanula lactiflora, and there are 2 varieties there, Pritchard's Blue and Loddon Anna, which is a pinky mauve.
And down below those, there's a very striking purple geranium.
Oh yes, that's Anne Folcard, not listed by many people because it's rather scarce, and I think it was produced by a vicar's daughter.
Oh, really?
But it's the attraction is the golden foliage, and it's a very good doer.
Yes, geraniums do quite well, actually, under those sort of circumstances.
Oh, they
don't
do.
they?
They're a great asset because you've got continuous flowering more or less all summer.
Yeah. Now, you have a bed of beautiful Alströmerias, and they're quite an old variety, aren't they?
That's the League 2 hybrids, and the most wonderful shades from biscuit right up to almost a deep cerise pink. And the colour range is amazing. And then I've got a very old, delightful yellow on its own, and I've put it in a bed by itself so you can see it alone.
But you're no stick-in-the-mud gardener, are you? Because you're also growing the very latest varieties too.
Yes, that's right. The Princess Lilies, as they're called. They are fantastic. They start flowering in May, and they go right on till October. And they last pretty well 6 weeks in water. They are incredible.
Hannah Hutchinson's garden is the result of years of experience, but I'll be showing in this series wonderful cottage gardens created by complete novices. And even if you know absolutely nothing about gardening at all, I promise you that you could do that too. That's the great beauty of cottage gardening. To explain how, I have built what I call an artisan's cottage garden here at Barnsdale. Artisans because I've made it just like the poorer cottage gardeners would have done, very cheaply, and I've done it all myself. And believe me, I'm no expert craftsman. All the techniques are so easy that anybody could do it. And the plants, like the old cottage garden plants, are all cheap to buy and easy to propagate and to grow. Now, during the course of the series, I'll be explaining how the garden was built, and we'll be jumping backwards and forwards in time to show how it developed. The garden is designed very simply in a straightforward, practical way, just like the old cottage gardeners would have done it. And even if you don't have a grain of knowledge of garden design, this is another thing that you can do too, because quite honestly, the garden more or less designs itself. What we need first of all is a path running from end to end of the garden, and that might just as well be in the middle and dead straight. It's essential, of course, to have a utility area to house the compost containers, the tool chest, the cold frame, and a small vegetable plot. So that's hidden away in one corner. And in the other corner, I've got my little patio with a bench and a table. And of course, I want to cover the fences with plants, so that needs a border and an access path too. To provide a quiet, shady place to sit, I've also included a rose-covered, sweet-smelling arbour. And of course that too needs a path to get to it. So all that leaves me with these 4 beds for plants in the middle. In the front, I've also included the almost obligatory picket fence, and that's planted with hardy annuals, with sweet peas twining along the top. And of course, the honeysuckle-covered arch to provide a warm and friendly welcome at the entrance. Of course, my artisan's garden is a million miles from the genuine old workers' cottage gardens of the 19th century. They still lived pretty deprived lives, but at about that time, a few wealthy landowners began a philanthropic movement to try to improve the workers' lot. A few of them even had whole villages built based on an extraordinary idealised version of rural bliss. These highly artificial communities were called model villages, and one such was Blaze Hamlets near Bristol. It was built in 1811 by a local tycoon, J.S. Harford, and designed in sickly sweet style by John Nash. There were 10 cottages, all self-consciously different and incredibly ornate. Some of them had thatched roofs, some of them were slated. There were incredible Elizabethan chimneys and dovecot fascias. And of course, gardens to match. The myth of simple rural bliss was perpetuated, and they contributed greatly to the gentrification of the cottage garden style. This picturesque view of the country dweller's lot was reinforced by artists and painters of the time like Miles Burkitt Foster and Helen Allingham. They painted dozens of charming country cottages with a wistful sentimentality that was very far from the truth. At the time that Helen Allingham painted it, this tiny 2-bedroomed cottage housed a family of no less than 8. And yet her interpretation includes a clean and well-fed little girl and her smiling, contented mum, and completely glossed over the malnutrition and disease that resulted from poor diet, cramped and damp living conditions, and the unremitting toil that was the lot of the rural poor in those days. And yet it was paintings like these that greatly influenced the wealthier classes, who probably didn't approach too close anyway, to believe that their lives were filled with bucolic charm and contentment. And so they built their own much grander and more comfortable cottages, and they planted them with flowery gardens to match. Those wonderful, romantic old cottage gardens may have been based on a misconception of an idyllic rural life, but they were nonetheless very inspiring indeed. And the style suits modern houses, whether they're in the town or the country, just as much as it did the rural thatched cottage. So I've built what I like to call my gentleman's cottage garden here at Barnsdale, and again, throughout the series, I'll be showing how it was made. Now, the design is, once again, modular, but this time it's divided into 5 very distinct and separate sections. This is the ornamental part of the garden, and we've got the straight cottage garden path again here. But this time it's made of brick, and it's embellished with a circle of brick planted with thyme. The borders are planted with the traditional mix of cottage garden flowers, and the whole thing is divided from the rest of the garden with a hardwood trellis planted with cottagey climbers. At this end of the plot there's a formal herb garden with gravel paths and beds edged with box, and when that grows up they'll be clipped to form low hedges. And over this side of the path, my secret garden. Once these plants grow up, it will be quite a quiet and private place. So I've decided on a bit of grass here where I can sit in seclusion. Over this side of the ornamental garden is the productive part. A small octagonal greenhouse will be plenty big enough for all my propagation needs and to raise pot plants and cut flowers for the house. And that's surrounded by soft fruit bushes interplanted with cottage flowers and a few of the larger herbs. And on the other side is the veg plot. Now this consists of a couple of 4-foot wide beds edged with clay tiles, and all around the edges are some more soft fruit, and over at the back some fan-trained apple trees. Then of course there's the beehive there, and once those roses grow up the posts and along the rope, that's going to look a picture. There's no denying that creating a garden from scratch is hard work, but the cottage gardeners I spoke to had no doubts that it was well worth it.
This is what's such fun, there's always something new. As you wake up in the morning and walk round, is that rose out or is something else out? And wonderful, wonderful. Spend all day in it, I do, all day. Love it.
It's not work at all. It really isn't like hard work. You come out here and you don't really intend to do anything, and before you know it, you're plucking out a weed here or moving something around or digging up a seedling. And it's all just fun, and you just forget what's happening in the rest of your life.
Why do you do it?
Well, just like doing it, that's all I think. Yeah. That's just the pass-wide time, you know.
Do you reckon that keeps you young?
Well, of course it do, yes. Hard work don't hurt anybody.
Next week we start building, and throughout the series we're going to show you how to turn this into this, and this into this. This country is filled with wonderful cottage gardens, and before starting to build mine at Barnsdale, I visited some of them to see what lessons I could learn. Gardens made by experts with years of experience could, I suppose, be a bit daunting for first-time gardeners, but that's the beauty of cottage gardening, and this has been proved over the centuries, that you can actually do it as you go along without any experience at all and still finish up with a beautiful garden. we found a young gardener just outside Peterborough who had started reluctantly and out of sheer necessity.
It was a totally boring rectangle with a concrete path right up the middle. Not a lot to recommend it really. It was also very, very overgrown, and we didn't even own a lawnmower at that time. Basically, it was just another space to be tidied, and so that's what I did.
So how did you get started on this sort of project?
Well, neighbours gave me some plants that when they were splitting up the herbaceous perennials, they gave me a few bits, and I thought I've got to put them somewhere. So I dug out one border, and that was it. I thought, it looks like a real garden, so carried on from there. Just evolved, and I liked what was happening. So the grass got smaller and the borders got bigger.
But you've planted it absolutely beautifully. You must have had some sort of idea of what you were doing, of where you were going to put plants.
Well, not really. It was just by eye. I got things given, or I bought things, and I put them where they looked good. And if they grew there and they were happy, that was fine. All fairly easy things. I like the hardy and very easy things.
And at that stage, did you know very much about gardening?
Nothing at all.
So how did you learn?
Well, I've watched television programmes, I've bought quite a lot of books, and I've learned by accident, really. It's just happened.
Just like Yvonne, the old cottage gardeners were inspired by a love of plants. Their gardens were cheap and cheerful, and following that tradition, I've built a completely do-it-yourself garden on a very tight budget, which I've called the Artisan's Garden. But later on, the cottage style was adopted by wealthier people, so I've made a second garden, this time sparing no expense, the gentleman's cottage garden. In this week's programme, I shall begin building, starting with the boundaries and then the basic structure, the borders, the paths, and the plants used to grow over and soften them. Well, when you start a new garden, the first thing to think about is the boundary. And the old cottage gardeners would have used a hedge, probably of quickthorn. And they would have grown plants through it like wild roses and clematis and made a very beautiful site. Later, the wealthier Victorian cottage gardeners used plants like yew, and that's what I've chosen for my gentleman's cottage garden. I've used quite large container-grown plants and fed them with just a little bone meal. Firming and a good watering will see them well on their way. The trouble is that for today's small gardens, a hedge can take up too much space. For that reason, I've decided to use a fence around my artisan's garden. But at least it is only 2 inches wide. Now, when these panels are first put up, they are a pretty ghastly orange colour, though they do fade a bit. But they're still a far cry from the cottage garden hedge. But there are alternatives. At least we can make our fence the same colour as the cottage garden hedge, which in fact makes a much better background for plants. Now, you can buy panels that are already stained green, but it's a little bit too light for our purposes, so I'm staining this with a much darker green wood stain. But if you want your roses and your clematis to twine through your artificial hedge, then you've got to provide them with the same sort of twiggy support that the quickthorn will give them. And you do that with wires. Make sure that first staple's in really firmly, or it could be dangerous. Now, when you get to the end, the first job is to put your staple in at the right height, but don't drive it right home. And then you can cut off the wire a little bit longer than you actually need it. Right there. Poke it through the staple. Straining the wire tight is a fine art. Get a bit of old but strong wood, wrap the wire round it with the wood close to the post, and then you can strain it like that and get it really tight, and then of course hammer the staple home. Now cut the excess off at the end, and then just wrap it round itself like that, and then you need one staple in at each post and the job's done. And by the summer the plants had grown up, twined around my artificial twiggy supports and created as beautiful a boundary as a real cottage garden hedge. Panel fencing will of course give you privacy, but if you're in a situation where you don't need it, and particularly if you've got a view that you don't want to hide, then there's no better alternative than the genuine cottage garden article, the picket fence. You can also buy these in sections and they're very easy to erect, and with cottage flowers planted either side, they look marvellous. If you can pinch a little bit of land in front of the picket fence, or even set it back a bit, you can create a marvellous effect. Of course, if your garden borders on the footpath or the road, then you must grow plants here that will put up with exhaust fumes and the attentions of passers-by, to say nothing of dogs. And the old-fashioned annuals really fit the bill. Of course, these are perfectly hardy, so they're very easy to raise from seed and very cheap too. In the early spring, all you have to do is to scratch a few drills, sow the seed into them, cover them up with your hand, and away they go. And what marvellous plants they are. There can't be anything easier to grow than the good old nasturtium. Like all the hardy annuals, it thrives on poor soil, and it'll flower its heart out right the way through the summer. Another old-fashioned favourite is the poached eggplant, and that one is a very good attractor of insects into the garden. Now this one is a bit of a newer introduction, but it's just as easy to grow. It's a poppy called ladybird, and it's not difficult to see why. The English marigold has been around forever, and once you've got this in your borders, it'll obligingly seed itself all over the place without ever becoming a nuisance. Now, many hardy annuals will do this, but bear in mind that you can collect the seed yourself from all of them and sow it where you want it. That's what I do with those Iceland poppies. Now, they're actually perennials, but I grow them as hardy annuals. Now, the sweet peas too are hardy annuals, and they can be sown in exactly the same way direct outside. But I raise mine in pots in the cold frame simply because that way you get an earlier show. And for flowers like these, I find it hard to wait. If you have a wall or a strong fence, you could cover it with roses to create a stupendous effect. These, I discovered, were grown in a quite surprising way.
Well, these are rambling roses. They're naturally pendular in habit. And what we decided to do was to make it more exciting by planting the rose on the other side so it would come up and flow over.
Oh, I see that.
And so you don't get the unsightly bare stem of the rose at the base of the wall on the other side.
What are the varieties you're using?
Well, we've used Albrecht Barbier here because it goes on flowering nearly all the summer. And beyond it, Wedding Day. And they're very nice colours, they work together very well.
After creating my version of a cottage garden hedge, my next job in the artisan's garden was to lay out the basic structure, the paths and the beds. As I pointed out last week, my design is very simple. Quite often, path edgings were elaborate. But the budget for our artisan's garden is very tight, so I'm using timber. This is 75 by 25mm softwood, and I've had it pressure treated with preservative so it should last for life. And I've also painted it dark green to match the fencing. But before I can edge the paths, I've got to set them out. Now, the central path runs straight down the middle of the garden, so it's a good idea to set up a datum line which actually cuts the garden right in half, and then you can measure everything from that. The central path is 3 foot wide, so if we measure 18 inches from there, that's the place to put the first line. The edgings are laid more or less on top of the soil because by the time you've dug the borders, it'll rise at least 10 centimetres. The edging's held by nailing it onto pegs made of the same material and about 30 centimetres long. You'll need 1 peg about every metre and a half, and make sure that it's perfectly true by checking it with the spirit level before you nail it onto the second peg. Oh, that didn't take long. Now all that remains is just to colour the cut ends with a little bit of the wood stain. Don't worry that these cut ends are going to let the water in, by the way, to rot the wood, because bear in mind that they're all pressure treated with preservative and the stain is only a colouring. Cottage gardeners can't afford to be too fussy about paths. Just level the soil, tread it down firmly and cover it with a layer of pea shingle. It makes a very serviceable path very cheaply. It will, however, leave you with straight, hard edges, which are not really in keeping with the cottagey feel. But with some careful planning, within a couple of months you can begin to see how the plants are tumbling out from the borders onto the paths and softening those hard edges. This antthemis is a great favourite of mine with lovely chalk white daisies and this superb silver foliage. And if you cut those daisies back when they finish flowering, the foliage remains attractive right the way through the season. Over here there are a couple of geums which are just beginning to tumble over the edge, and the garden pinks down here which are newly planted but will soon fall over the edges too. The aubrietia here has really finished and that's got to be cut back very shortly, but that'll soon be replaced by another antthemis, but this time with green foliage and bright golden flowers. And now we've got a couple of spaces down here, so I'm going to plant some more to tumble over the edge. This one is a real traditional old cottage garden plant. It's called Bouncing Bet or Saponaria, and that will go in there and make a beautiful cushion of these deep pink flowers. And near to it I'm planting a plant that the old cottage gardeners certainly wouldn't have known. This is a diacia, and that too has a mound-forming habit and will produce lovely deep pink flowers. There are other materials that I could have used for the path in my artisan's garden which are cheap and equally successful. With a bark path like this, you can even dispense with the edging. And old bricks look wonderful too, especially if plants are allowed to spread around and in between them.
So we potter through and...
I do like your paths here, Mark. I mean, did you do these yourself?
Yes.
Where did
Yes,
the
we laid
bricks
them.
come from?
They were all laying about somewhere. I suppose they had been used for other buildings.
Do you find that you get problems with flaking? Because these are obviously wall bricks,
Yes,
aren't they?
I have to replace a certain number every year.
Do you find that you get a lot of weed seeding into it?
Yes, they're wonderful conditions for seeding.
But you also get plants seeding.
There's some wonderful natural seeding, which we encourage.
You've got plants which grow over the edges too. Now, what sort of things do you use there?
Well, I think they almost tend to happen more than we use them, but I mean, the ajugas obviously spread well. There's
This
blue,
bugle,
the
yeah,
blue
it's
one, and there's a
lovely.
nice pink form over there, which for some unknown reason is called purple torch. And the dianthus, of course, the old cottage pinks.
And what's that?
It's a little variegated London pride.
In the gentleman's cottage garden, I could afford to go to town, so I decided to use special brick paviers. First, I set up a wooden edging, in the same way that I did for the gravel paths. Then, to make a solid base, I used a dry mix of ballast and cement, which was consolidated again with the well-worn boots. A layer of builder's sand goes on top, and that's raked roughly level and once more trodden down. Then it's finally levelled with a notched board to ensure that it's at the right height for the bricks. They can be laid out in a variety of patterns. They're quite easy to cut with a hammer and brick bolster. Then cover the lot with kiln-dried sand. You can get it from the builders' merchants. You can bash them down with a wide board and a fencing post, but the easy way is to spread out a bit of old carpet, hire a vibrating pad, and just run it up and down. Put on a bit more sand, brush it off, and the path looks great. Where the paths crossed, I planned a circular area, so I started by setting the outside circle of bricks, and then I sunk a flower pot in the middle. Well, with all the bricks now down and sand brushed into the joints, the circle's beginning to look quite nice, and now it's time for the finishing touches. And I can reveal what this flower pot in the middle is for. It's a bit like those Russian dolls, really, that fit inside each other. And what we do is to put the next size flower pot down inside this one. There's a little bit of sand in the bottom just to make sure that they finish up exactly level at the top. And that does take a little bit of fiddling about. But in the end, it looks rather nice. And the final pot can be just planted up with a plant of thyme, and that will eventually spread out just enough to break those hard lines. I've left planting holes in the brick circle, which I filled with equal parts of soil, garden compost and coarse grit, because the thymes which I've planted there like a very well-drained compost. The edges of this path have been softened by planting box hedging. Very formal, of course, but with a very informal planting behind. The two go well together. And the hard texture of the brick paving has been further softened by using containers. All kinds of pots give you the opportunity to be adventurous and original with your planting. This one is filled with a mixture of tender perennials, like osteospermums, geraniums, marguerites and diacias. And every cottage garden I visited used pots filled with seasonal flowers. good preparation of the borders will really pay dividends later on. So when you dig, work in plenty of manure, spent mushroom compost, or one of the alternatives. From the earliest times, cottage gardeners have known the importance of keeping their soil highly fertile.
Most cottage gardens kept a pig, and this pig was kept for food, of course. All the dung from the animal and the straw was all dug into the cottage garden, quite an important part of the fertility. The privy at the bottom of the garden was also a very important part of that. This was cleaned out on a regular basis.
Well, of course, they looked upon night soil, as they called it, really very much as a resource rather than a waste product, didn't they?
Oh, indeed.
They had some very peculiar ways of collecting it.
Yes, a classic example is here at the Open Air Museum, where there's an upstairs privy and, of course, a hole cut into the floorboards and a pit some 10 foot below it. Now, of course, all the waste from there went into the pit, along with probably the ashes from the wood fire, probably waste material from the kitchens, vegetable waste and so on and so forth, all mixed in, trenches dug in the garden, and it emptied in on a regular basis, and this was one of their main sources of garden fertility.
No one seems to use night soil anymore, but I found that to some cottage gardeners, manure was still as important as ever.
I have that farmyard manure, and I think that's the best stuff to put in the garden.
What sort of muck is it?
Big muck from the farm where I used to work. Well, I've done 52 years with them, you see, on the same farm.
Yeah. The soil type will mainly dictate what needs to be added.
The initial thing was firstly to put in plenty of well-rotted manure, masses of it, more than is really recommended. And that is because the soil here is extremely dry. It's right by the river, very silty, and as I say, it's got no guts in it at all.
Then you don't use fertiliser at all?
Very rarely, because the soil is poor, that I don't think it's going to do the plants much good to put too much fertiliser on. I'd rather spend money on plants and let the plants get used to the soil conditions I've got.
Others agree that it's important to grow plants that will suit the soil.
We normally get about the same rainfall as Jerusalem, that is about 20 inches, which is little enough, but in drought years that goes down to about 16. And here we're on gravel soil, which acts just like a giant colander. Although the surface may get wet, in actual fact, down at the bottom, about a foot down, it's just dust. So you have to find plants that will deal with that, and a lot of plants will not. I put on lots and lots of leaf mould. I've ceased to put manure on the garden because I find it promotes a sort of fleshy growth, and then the plants are even less able to take the drought in their stride. So that I think it's best to grow them as hard as possible, but just improve the soil a bit.
Sometimes it is possible to change the soil to suit the plants. Mine is heavy clay, but that wasn't going to stop me growing one of the great cottage garden favourites. It's extremely difficult to grow good pinks on heavy clay soil like mine. They must have a good bit of drainage, so you've got to improve it in some way. Well, I use my magic mix, which is a mixture of equal parts of garden compost, or you could use spent mushroom compost just as well, and coarse grit, and a little bit of organic fertiliser thrown in. And of course, raising the beds too actually improves the drainage as well. Now, the old cottage gardeners used to grow some wonderful pinks, lovely dainty markings, and of course a very strong perfume too. But you know, we can even improve on those today. The trouble with them was that they only flowered once during the season, so the hybridists had a go at them, and they've produced a race of modern pinks. But many of them have actually lost their perfume, and some of them have lost those lovely markings too. So they've had another look, and they've now produced pinks which have the best of all worlds. They have the delicate markings, they have the heady perfume, and they'll flower right the way through the season. Things like Becky Robinson, which is a lovely pink with crimson markings. That's a double, and it has a superb perfume as well. And then there are varieties like Grand's Favourite, which is white with scarlet lacing on it, and again a superb perfume, and they'll flower on and off right through the season. Roses are, of course, obligatory in cottage gardens, and these, I think, say it all. This wonderful little gingerbread cottage in Rutland is about the prettiest I think I've seen, and the roses add that final touch that's perfectly in tune. But then it doesn't really matter what sort of house you live in, growing plants on the walls will always improve it. Next week we'll be looking at vertical structures and what to grow on them, from roses to clematis, wisteria to honeysuckle. When you grow upwards, the sky's the limit.
I just plant because I like the plants, and that's it. I just like plants. When I was at work, I couldn't do gardening very often. My hours of work were very difficult. But I used to have pots, containers, whatever I could get plants into and what time I had available. The dream was to always have a cottage with about 1 acre of garden. We all have these dreams, but I never thought mine would materialise, and it did. I used to see this cottage as I passed by before the hedge was so high, many years ago, and always liked the look of it. And when I found it had been restored and was livable in, this was the one for me when it came on the market.
In just 6 years, Leslie Holmes created this magnificent cottage garden from nothing.
What I try to achieve here is a mixture of the wild with the cultivars. Close, compact planting does give you a lot of help in keeping the weeds down, providing you've cleared a lot of the perennials beforehand.
Leslie's garden covers about 1 acre, but it's never possible to see more than a fraction of that at any one time.
I visualise, which I've produced here, lots of winding pathways, enabling you to come across certain plants which will hold your attention and cause you to go on looking. Because I feel if you could walk in a garden and you can see the whole effect straight away, half the interest is gone.
This garden is a perfect example of how to create more or less instant height, and that's what we'll be concentrating on in this programme. How to build the supporting structures, what plants to use, and how to plant them.
I wanted to create upward growth as much as possible because all my previous gardens I've been living on the flat, as it were, and it's all very nice, but I feel if you can grow things upwards you get a much better effect, particularly in a flat area. And pergola, archways, bowers, pillars seem to do the trick.
Well, I've built pergolas out of rustic poles, only to find that they last probably a couple of years before they rot off. So you've got to be a bit careful about the materials, haven't you?
Yes, these are steam-treated posts. I don't know whether it's cuprinol they treat them with, but one of the wood protectives. And they are spiked, ready. We put them into the ground about 18 inches, into a lot of rubble. No concrete has been used on any of them because it's very heavy clay anyway. And most of this area, and it's a 60-foot long pergola, were completed within the week.
Now, what about the roses? Have you used climbers or ramblers?
A mixture of climbers and ramblers, and not a few shrubs which behave like climbers. Again, I think because the garden is so tightly packed with plants that it's causing them to give extra growth.
That visit inspired me to go for instant height too. So when my demonstration artisan's garden was dug over, I started with the climbers. One of the great advantages with container-grown roses that you can plant them at any time of the year, but just note on this plant that this has been pruned back really quite hard. It may seem odd with a plant that you're trying to grow up high to actually prune it back hard in the first season, but it is the thing to do because you can see this lovely strong growth coming out, and that's going to produce a really strong and healthy rose. Now, the first thing to do is to give it a good watering. Even if it seems wet, every container-grown plant needs to go in really moist, otherwise those roots never seem to get out of the compost. We just allow that to drain away a little bit. That's fine. And then it can come out of the pot. And that can go into the hole. Now when you put it in, you want to plant it just slightly deeper than it grew on the nursery. So just use the cane that came with it just to check that it's at the right level. Planting it deeply encourages shoots to come up from the bottom. And then what we want is a bit of fertiliser. And that goes in just around the top of the soil here. Now what I do is just to chip a little bit of topsoil in around the plant, like that. Then you know you're getting the best of the topsoil in around the roots. And then gently firm with your boots. There's no need to set it in concrete, particularly if you've got heavy soil. And then the rest of the soil can go back on top. Now when this grows a little bit, these shoots will be tied into the horizontal wires to train them, and that's absolutely no problem at all. But when it comes to clematis, it's a completely different matter. Now they will climb by twining their leaf stalks around the support. So if you want the clematis to grow up the fence, you've got to provide some vertical wires as well as the horizontal ones. And you do that by twisting a bit of thinner wire up and down here around the horizontal wires. But if you're growing it next to a rose, there's no reason why you shouldn't use the rose to support the clematis. Pruning old climbing or rambling roses is quite different from pruning modern bush roses. John Scarman has a method which I must say was new to me.
The way it's pruned is twice during the summer. Just before it flowers, it will have great big long shoots coming out of it. And you immediately think, I can't cut these off because like a raspberry cane, it's next year's flowering wood. In actual fact, it doesn't quite work like that.
John has already pruned his superb rambler Bobby James, which covers his wall. But he used it to demonstrate the technique.
What we do is we cut off these shoots, and you can see here that this was actually 10 foot or so long. People don't like this because they assume that you're cutting off next year's flowering growth. But in reality, what you're doing is you're encouraging this very twiggy sort of growth. And all the energy of the rose goes into these little flowers, and they, all of them, develop.
So I see, so what you're really doing is growing the shape of the plant as a rambler to start with, to get it up there, and then treating the top like a shrub rose.
Exactly.
Well, this is a shrub. Now, it's much smaller, obviously, than the Bobby James, but is this at the right stage?
Yes, it is. You can prune these at any time, but we like to prune them now so that you get the nice shape, and it's quite straightforward. You're pruning for architecture. You haven't got time to look for the favourable outward-facing bud. It just simply isn't feasible. And with old shrub roses, it doesn't do them any harm at all. It's just a question of going for the shape. The whole idea is that you actually expose the flowers, which would otherwise be hidden by all this young growth. All the energy goes into the flowers, and you present the whole shrub, and indeed the garden, with a nice architectural feel about it.
Those lovely old-fashioned climbers and ramblers really are superb, but they do have perhaps the one snag that many of them will only flower once early in the season, with perhaps a few flowers a little bit later on afterwards. So in order to extend the period of colour, it's a good idea to grow through them another climber. This lovely old rambler, Alberic barbier, for example, produces a terrific flush of flowers early in the season, and with regular dead heading, a few more through the year too. To increase the flowering impact, I've grown a Clematis étoile violette through it. That gives me colour from July right through to late October. Of course, there are dozens of modern clematis that suit the cottage garden very well, many of them with large flowers, and many, like the Star of India there, with a very long flowering period. But if you're going to grow clematis through roses, you need something like the Viticellas or this one, Texensis pagoda. The secret is to choose varieties that flower late in the year, and then when they finish flowering, you can cut them right down to within about a foot of the ground and pull all the old clematis stalks out of the rose, and that will give it a chance to ripen its buds, so it'll give you a really good show of flowers the following year, and of course the clematis will come back too. Well, though roses and clematis are certainly my favourite climbers, there are, of course, others too. Something like Solanum crispum is a real high-value climber because it'll go on producing these lovely purple flowers right the way through from June to November. If you look closely at the flowers, you can see that it's a relative of the potato, but in any beauty contest, this Solanum wins hands down. Of course, no cottage garden would be complete without honeysuckle. This is the variety Serratina, and it's pretty close to our native woodbine, which for me still has the most delicious perfume of them all. Of course, there's no need to restrict the planting to one species. Here I've grown a vine through sweet-scented summer-flowering jasmine. You can grow climbers through living structures too. The apple tree makes a perfect natural climbing frame for the rose. But cottage gardeners all have their own individual methods, and everywhere I visited I found different ideas. Pat, the rose-covered arch must be one of the most traditional features in a cottage garden, and you've got a lovely rustic one here. But the difference is this rope. What's the idea of that?
Well, the idea is that the roses will climb along it eventually, but it's taking a long time for them to get the idea. The roses have been there now for 6 years, and they're just beginning, as you can see, to go. But it is taking a long time.
And these are rambler roses, I
yes,
assume,
they
are
are,
they?
yes.
Yes, which are a little bit more vigorous.
Yes.
Now, the rope is a black hemp rope. Did you actually treat it?
No, we didn't. We bought it like this from a ship, Chandler's, so presumably it is already treated.
It's going to make a lovely feature, actually, when it's done.
Well, I hope so, yeah.
If I see a brilliant idea, I have no qualms about copying it. So I did just that in my gentleman's garden. But in the artisan's garden, I had a completely different plan. When I built this little arbour, I decided that what I needed was something over the other side of the garden to really catch the eye, because that will increase the apparent length of the garden. And what fits the bill perfectly is a little obelisk. Now, I saw one of these in an upmarket garden centre and just copied it. And I made it for about 1/10 of their price. My one is made with roofing laths, which of course are already pressure treated with preservative when you buy them. It's very simple to make, really. They're just screwed together and held at the top with a piece of outdoor quality plywood. The only thing you have to remember is that these thinner battens on the inside must be nailed on before you put the whole thing together, because it's quite difficult to get a hammer inside there. And it's finished off with a little orb on the top, and that is the plastic ball from a lavatory cistern. Now, I wanted to create, as soon as possible, a great pyramid of colour and perfume here, so I've decided to use annual sweet peas. Now, I reckon that the old cottagers had the right idea about sweet peas, because every one they grew was perfumed, and some of the modern varieties aren't. I don't think there's any point in growing sweet peas unless they're perfumed, so make sure when you buy the seed that your varieties are. I've raised them myself in my little cold frame, and I must admit that the work did catch up with me a little bit, so I'm a bit late planting them out, but still I potted them on and they'll be perfectly okay. Yes, they've got a jolly good root system there. And I've already put a bit of fertiliser in the soil. Now, they'll need a little bit of help once they've reached the obelisk there, but I've just got to wait and leave them to grow on a little bit first. By midsummer, the obelisk was completely obscured by a cascade of sweetly smelling sweet peas. In my money-no-object gentleman's cottage garden, the climbers scramble up a beautiful trellis. It's made of hardwood, so I could concrete it directly into the ground without fear of rotting. It is expensive, but it should last a lifetime, just weathering to a lovely shade of soft grey. I've used my trellis to divide up the garden, and for the small plot it's the perfect way, because it makes the division effectively, but because you can still see through it, it doesn't make the garden look smaller. And of course it takes up very little space. But if your garden is big, then it can sometimes be a positive advantage to divide it up into smaller areas. If you have the space, you can create living structure in the garden by dividing it with hedges. If it's a tall hedge you want, perhaps for a windbreak, then you could use closely clipped conifers. But if you only want a low-growing hedge, then Lonicera nitida will suit very well. If you keep this closely clipped, it will provide a very compact hedge, and look how well it contrasts with the more informal foliage of the copper beech. Then there's the traditional cottage garden mixed hedge.
It's a mixture of holly and hawthorn. Well, at least it was when we came. It's now got spindleberry and it's got honeysuckle in it and a bit of yew. And I'm waiting for some researcher to come and tell me that makes it 400 years old because it's got 4 different species in it. We decided that we'd extend the hedge there. So I went round the garden and found bird-sown seedlings of hawthorn and yew and holly and planted that, and that's now 4 foot high.
These are things that just appeared, really, in the garden.
There's a particular branch of a tree you can see they sit on to have a good old chat and possibly a snooze, and beneath that you'll find all sorts of seedlings. And I was pleased to find yew seedlings because I put that in the hedge and that will help to thicken it in the winter.
But if it's flowers you're after, you can't beat a rose hedge. I was particularly taken with this one at Cottage Garden Roses.
This is a lovely thing. It's Rosa complicata. It's from the Middle Ages. It's probably a hybrid between the Gallica and Rosa macrantha. Marvellous perfume. And it also has the most fantastic hips in the autumn. And again, we prune off this sort of growth just before it flowers, and again in the autumn to keep it like this.
Well, this is now about, what, 4 to 5 feet high. Will it get any bigger?
Oh yes, we want it to get up to about 6 or 7 feet, but the problem is if we let it get there all in one go, which it could quite easily do, it'll then start to fall over.
OK, so how do you prevent that?
Well, when you get the young plant from the nursery, it's been pruned, and that's your pruning height. Then after that, it flowers, and that's your flowering height. And you prune halfway between the flowering height and the pruning height. And you keep doing that and build the plant up slowly. This is quite a vigorous variety, and it's taken about 4 years to get here.
And the pruning you do in the winter?
Yes, but any time in the winter. Old roses don't mind.
And how long will it have these amazing flowers for?
About 6 weeks or so. And then they're followed in the autumn by these wonderful hips that you can see developing behind the flower there.
So, of course, the very last thing you should do is to deadhead these roses. And despite popular opinion, it doesn't take forever to grow a terrific hedge. The gentleman's cottage garden is beginning now to get a feeling of enclosure because the yew hedge that I planted last winter has put on quite a bit of growth. It's put on about 23 centimetres, that's 9 inches, in just 1 year. So perhaps yew is not quite as slow growing as you may have thought. Now, I shan't do anything about trimming the top yet. What I'm going to do is to wait until it's got to about 9 inches higher than I eventually want it. And then I shall cut it back to 6 inches lower than I eventually want it. And that will enable it to make a nice bushy head so that I can cut a really clean top to it. But I do need to cut the sides of the hedge now, and it's not a bad idea in this case to just put a line out along the ground just to give you a rough idea of where you need to cut. Over the other side, where I've got all the plants, of course I can't do that, so I should just have to manage it by eye. But one of the great advantages a yew hedge has over plants like Leylandi, for example, is that it will grow out from old wood. So even if you make the most horrendous mistake, it will always grow out again. I've given it the best possible chance by reducing the competition from weeds and retaining moisture with this thick organic mulch. And I've also protected it from cold winter winds, which tend to scorch the foliage, by putting up this wattle fence. Now, this went up when the hedge was planted, and it'll stay up for 1 more winter, by which time the hedge will be really well established and out of danger. This privet hedge is a wonderfully eccentric example of an old cottage garden tradition. An idea that cottage gardeners copied from the big house was the fashion for topiary. And these magnificent yew topiaries are at least 160 years old, and they more or less fill the small front garden of this little cottage. Mind you, the cottage is in the grounds of Haddon Hall in Derbyshire, and the boar's head and the peacock represent the coats of arms of previous owners, so it's quite likely that the steward who lived here was told to plant the yews here and train them in this shape. But there were plenty of cottage gardeners who did it just for fun, and indeed they still do. Now that's golden privet, George, isn't it?
Yes, that's what that is.
It's a lovely shape. Did you plant it?
Well, I expect I must have planted it in the first place, but I've been there a lot of years, you see, and I almost forget about it.
And did you actually decide on shaping it like that?
Well, yes, I cut it into that shape.
Yeah. What gave you the idea for that?
Don't know. It just come to me, I said, when I was a clipping of it, you see, and thought I'd make a little shape of it. Yes, that's...
So how often do you have to clip that?
I do it twice a year, anyway.
To find out more about cottage garden topiary, I went to visit Elizabeth Brainbridge at Langley Boxwood Nurseries. She started by showing me how to clip spirals.
You need a strong bush because you're going to cut a lot away from it. Shears and secateurs, and you walk around it a few times and take a few deep breaths. And what you're aiming for, to make it easy for yourself, is think of parallel curves downwards. Most right-handed people will do it in this direction. What I do is to start about here, making the parallel curves like that. A lot of walking around is involved, and you snip it just gently at first.
Now, a lot of the books suggest that you should put a bit of string or something around there to give you a guide, but you don't do that.
I don't, partly because we have a lot of these bushes to do, and you get better at doing it with practice. The nice thing about living sculptures, they are living, and they will grow again by the end of the season. So you don't have to be too terrified of making a mistake, and we all make mistakes. Now, very often with topiary, if it's not looking right, it's because you haven't actually been quite fierce enough. Proportion is everything too, but you can't get that right first time off.
And so you could say that by next season you will have that as a perfect spiral.
It'll be well clothed in foliage by next season, because again we've cut a lot off. It will replace itself with a lot of shooting, a lot of new young shoots, and it should look pretty good.
Of course, there are many more exotic shapes, often illustrating the cottage gardener's traditional sense of humour. Many of these will have involved more than just clipping. With a couple of canes and ties, Elizabeth started to turn this bush into what will become a very respectable chicken. It'll take clever clipping and another 6 months before it begins to look really good, but I began to see the shape straight away. Well, actually, that is beginning to look the part already, isn't it? I put 2 of these into my gentleman's cottage garden, and I found immense satisfaction in clipping my 2 roosters into shape. And these funny, formal structures do fit very well into the generally less disciplined feel of the traditional cottage garden. The cottage garden is essentially a place to be used, just as much as the cottage itself. And what better place on a sunny summer's day to sit and read or talk or just think than a lovely scented arbour like this. But of course, before the garden can be used, just like the cottage, it has to be furnished. Now, a gentleman cottage gardener may well go down to the garden centre ancient credit card in hand and simply buy it. But we artisans will still set to and make it and plant it ourselves. And that's for next week's programme. Throughout history, gardens have been essential to the lives of cottagers, and I think they still are. Few of us today need to grow vegetables and herbs to keep body and soul together, but some modern uses are just the same as they've always been. There's an old countryman's saying that says, "Sometimes I sits and thinks, and sometimes I just sits." And I think that that sums up a very important part of the cottage garden. Everyone should have somewhere where they can sit and just contemplate the garden and relax and let the stresses of life just drain away. So in my gentleman's cottage garden, I've invested in a relatively expensive love seat. But it's not as expensive as you might think, because I searched around and found a local craftsman who built this for about 2/3 of the cost of the ones advertised in the glossy magazines. I think that's quite an important thing to do, because not only do you save yourself money, but I think that we cottage gardeners ought to be keeping those rural crafts alive. And I made sure when he built it that he incorporated a trellis in the side so that I can grow some perfumed climbers. This little clematis is a small flowered clematis with a large, unmanageable name, I'm afraid, Tritonata rubro-marginata, quite a mouthful. But it has a beautiful vanilla perfume which really fills this little arbour. And growing on the trellis at the sides there is a quite vigorous rambler, Bobby James, which will eventually cover the whole arbour with beautiful trusses of white perfumed flowers. It is a vigorous plant, but as we saw last week, it's quite easy to keep it under control. This week, I'll be showing how I made the structures in my own cottage gardens and looking at some of those in established gardens that inspired them. Of all the cottage gardeners I visited, Roger Pickering was the most ingenious. And that's a green man, isn't it?
It is a green. It's my version of a green man, anyway.
Well, you can find these in churches and old buildings all around the country. What exactly was it?
It's an old pagan thing. I don't quite know. I presume it's something to do with fertility. It's equivalent of, you know, the old earth goddess. I don't know.
And where did you get it?
Oh, I carved that.
My goodness, what's the stone?
Well, it's just old soft building block. Not the concrete ones, all the soft insulating.
Yeah.
It's quite soft, actually. It's easily workable.
You're a talented man, you know, Roger.
Well, a good bodger.
Real cottage gardeners don't buy a lot for their gardens. If you visit a genuine old cottage like this one, you'll find all sorts of examples of what the old cottagers would call make do and mend. Now, this garden shed, for example, used to be an air raid shelter in World War II. But when the bombs stopped falling, it was much too valuable to throw away. So it was dismantled, transported here and re-erected, and it's been here ever since. This garden bench used to be an old sofa that fell to pieces. And with the addition of a few bits of scrap timber and an old carpet to add a touch of luxury, it makes a serviceable place for the gardener who lives here to take a break in between spells of digging. And there's no doubt at all that in this particular setting, it's a thing of beauty. But the seat in one cottage garden I visited appeared a bit more sophisticated.
Well, it's homemade.
It's homemade?
Yes.
Well, it's stone, surely.
Well, it's made of concrete.
But it's got these lovely curved edges on it.
Yes, well, my husband made it, and we decided we wanted a seat just big enough for two of us to sit on, so we sat on the floor in the living room on a piece of brown paper and drew round our two bottoms, making a pattern from which he...
It's really tailor-made,
turned out a concrete seat, yes.
And how did you get these edges?
Well, this is a piece of pipe cut in half and laid around the edge of the moulding.
What, ordinary hose pipe?
Yes.
Is it reinforced?
Yes, it is. Has a piece of wire mesh incorporated in the concrete.
It's brilliant. He's a clever chap, isn't he? And hasn't it weathered down well?
Yes, it has.
Really nice. Well, I'm certainly not going to try and compete with that masterpiece, but it isn't difficult to knock up your own garden furniture very cheaply. This bench, for example, is made with a few bits of 50mm square timber and some very strong timbers for the seat and the back, and it's all just screwed together to make a very serviceable bench. But if you're going to eat out in the garden, or just have a cup of tea really, then you need a table. And this is a little bit more elaborate. Now the legs are very strong. They're made with fencing posts, and they support a 15cm, that's 6-inch deep box. The box is filled with a very gritty compost and planted up with thyme. And I've set into it these thin tiles to give me somewhere to rest my cup or my plate. It's a table that will never need a cloth because it provides its own tapestry of beautiful colour and perfume too. Cheers. If your house is small, and particularly if it's terraced, you very often won't have a garage, and certainly in a small garden, no room for a garden shed. So it's difficult to know what to do with the tools. Well, this chest should solve the problem. It's very cheap and easy to make using floorboards for the front and the sides, and the top is made with ordinary feather edge fencing boards. But once again, do make sure that you get it pressure treated with preservative. It's quite big enough to hold all the tools that you're going to want for a garden of this size. If you're more tidy-minded than I am, then you could fit it out with hooks to hold the tools and shelves and even drawers. And it tucks away in the corner there where it takes up very little space. The traditional cottage garden arch is more or less essential, and I was intrigued by some metal ones I discovered at Cottage Garden Roses.
We actually went to the Black Country Museum to find out how they were made, and they were steel bent on edge. And the important point about that is that they're actually quite strong and that they give in the wind, whereas a rigid structure would be inclined to blow right out.
Well, once again, of course, you've covered it with roses. What is this one?
This is Tuscany Superb. It's a rose from the Middle Ages, and it's a shrub rose. But actually, shrub roses make very good climbing roses if you just take them up slowly, a little bit at a time, and tie them in as they go.
And down here is an arch with two roses on, this lovely soft violet, and this one is something like Rosamundi, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It's actually an Italian rose from the turn of this century. It's called Variegata di Bologna. Marvellous perfume. And the joy of the game with shrub roses is that they do actually frame an arch very attractively.
Now, this arch is quite wide.
Yes, it is. It's 6 foot wide. The idea being that two people can walk through side by side, whereas if you have a 4-foot arch, you have to go through Indian style.
Well, you're lucky, John, really, to have that sort of space most of us don't have. But you've got some narrower arches here. done, I think, in a very artistic way to make a sort of a garden divider.
Yes, that's the idea, that you don't actually cut the whole garden off, that you get glimpses of the garden through it. And I think you need that, makes you want to go into the garden because you can actually see what's beyond you.
Another very beautiful arch can be made out of willow withies woven together. But not all the cottage gardeners I talked to insisted on traditional materials. Now here, just outside the house, you've got a lovely arch with a rose on one side and a clematis on the other, and it's wooden. Or is it?
No, it isn't wood, you're quite right. It's made of waste polystyrene and it's completely solid. It doesn't need any protection at all of any kind. You can hammer nails into it. They make furniture, garden furniture, edging.
Is that the edging down there?
Yes, that is it, there. And it's a dual purpose, as you see, holding the soil back and looking very nice at the same time.
Whatever it's made of, an arch makes a beautiful feature, and nowhere more so than over the front gate. And it's very easy to make. If you can handle a saw and a screwdriver, then you're home and dry. Though there are a couple of things in the toolkit that you might not have that I think are worth buying because I found them invaluable. But do bear in mind that if the budget doesn't run to it, you can hire all these things very cheaply from the local hire shop. Most people will have the basic toolkit, but what you might not have is a long spirit level, which is invaluable when you're setting things like fence posts. And there are quite a lot of angles in the archway in particular, so a bevel square is a very useful tool. And another thing which I found I couldn't do without was a rechargeable electric drill. Now, if you haven't got electricity in the garden, this is the perfect tool. I've already put the upright posts in, and these are put in exactly like ordinary fence posts. The only thing to notice is that I've put them into metal sockets, which are actually concreted into the ground. Now, all the timber, you'll remember, is pressure treated with preservative, but putting them in those sockets just makes doubly sure that they'll last for life. I've made sure that all the woodwork is very simple. The only technique you might have to master is cutting the angle. Start by measuring carefully and then mark the edge of the wood with the set square. The angle on the face of the wood is marked with the preset bevel square, and then you can saw it, starting off very gently and carefully and keeping to both lines. In fact, the building techniques involved in all the stuff I've made for the artisan's garden are pretty easy. There are no complicated woodworking joints to master because you mostly join one bit of wood to another with simple metal angle brackets. The heftier bits are drilled first and then held with coach screws, which are driven home with a spanner. Some small pieces are screwed on, and bits like the roofing lath trellis are held with nails. The final job is to put on these finials, and they have two very important purposes. First of all, you'll see that at the front of the arch my woodwork leaves quite a lot to be desired, and the finial will cover a multitude of sins. But much more important is its traditional use. It stopped the devil sitting on top of the arch. Once the honeysuckle starts to grow and cover the arch, you can begin to see how welcoming this is going to be. And the little rose arbor over here is made in more or less the same way. It's a little wider, and of course you can make it any width that you want. And there are one or two differences. The back is also filled in with trellis, and I've also provided a seat here made out of thick timber because quite obviously you don't want to fall through it, do you? This one has got a roof on it as well, and the roof is made with ordinary feather edge fencing timber. My final touch was to nail on this horseshoe, obviously put on upright so that it catches all the luck that's in the garden. Now, I actually dug that out of the garden here when I was preparing it, and I feel that it's important to keep and use all these relics just in order to preserve the continuity. Even in this beautiful cottage garden attached to a modern house, Roger Pickering has managed to make links with gardens of the past.
Now, they're all sherds of pottery or tile that have been dug up in this garden.
When do they date from?
The earliest pieces are Roman.
Gosh, which one is Roman?
Well, you've got a Roman tesserae there from the old floors. Yeah. And then we've got a medieval floor tile. A bit of early medieval, where possibly from Nuneaton or Potter's Marston, and right up to 19th or 18th century clay pipe. It's reasonably early, as I understand it. I mean, I'm no expert. It's a fairly shallow angle, that.
Now, Roger, you live in a modern house with a modern cottage garden, but I think that you have the soul of an old cottage gardener because you collect all sorts of junk and turn it into something beautiful. Tell me about these seats.
Well, these baths, as they are, I don't know where we acquired them originally, but they were in the sheds, I think, in the old garden. And when I came across to here, which is, what, 4.5 years ago, we just used them as holding ponds for the fish.
Oh, because they're old bungalow baths, aren't they?
Yeah. And after we'd finished using them, once we dug a pond and so forth, I got them stacked up here somewhere, and I was about to throw them down, the local tip. And it seemed such a shame, and it suddenly struck me. I don't know why or when or how, but they'd make a seat.
And you're not going to like this, Roger. Sometimes you do make mistakes, don't you? What about your windows?
Oh, well, it was a wooden shed behind there, and it looked pretty gaunt, actually, so I started to build a stone front on it. Now, we had this old bookcase, it was in pieces, in the roof of the old house, and we brought it across and stored it here. And it suddenly struck me that the two doors on the bookcase would make windows, and that's what I did. And it wasn't until the place was complete that when I was cleaning the glass from the inside, I discovered there was a name scratched inside, as they did with a diamond ring, years ago.
Yeah.
And it says, John Hollins Jr., 20th of December, 1767. So, I've broken up a very good piece of furniture, actually, to make a couple of windows.
The perfume in my arbour comes from roses, but one of the plants they would have used in the old gardens quite widely would have been the native honeysuckle, or what they called woodbine. Of course, that's been superseded these days by many other varieties, but I still think that the old woodbine has the very best fragrance of all. So I wanted to grow it in my own garden. Well, there are nurseries who stock it, but I searched around and couldn't find it at all. And then one day, no doubt because of the horseshoe nailed to my arbour, I had an amazing piece of luck. I was standing at the garden gate and looking out at the hedgerow nearby when suddenly I saw, growing over an old wire fence, the native woodbine. I don't know how it got there, perhaps a seed was dropped by a bird, but that now enabled me to do exactly what the old cottagers would have done to bring it into my own garden. Now, of course, these days you can't dig up wild plants, that's against the law. But what you can do is, in June or July, to take leaf bud cuttings, and they're a lot easier than they sound. The first thing to do is to take off a stem, and you get several cuttings from one stem, put it into a polythene bag, keep it in the shade and get home as fast as you can. Now, if you haven't got a workbench in the garden, what you can do is to adapt the tool chest as I've done. All it needs is a little flap of wood hinged to the front and held with a little toggle. And when you pull it down, it sets the top of the toolbox level. You can put your potting bench on top of that and it's easy to work. And then you cut the stem up, cutting either side of a leaf to leave pieces of stem, I suppose something like 1 inch long. Now, don't put hormone rooting powder on them because that could stop them growing out. Just as they are, put them into a pot of coir compost so that the top of the bud is just above compost level. Cover them up with a polythene bag, put an elastic band around it and put them in the cold frame. They should root in about 6 to 8 weeks. And of course, if you want one plant, take 10 cuttings. I think it's vital to grow scented plants near to anywhere you might sit in the garden. For example, in the area I laughingly call my patio, I'm absolutely surrounded by perfume. Probably the best of all comes from roses, and I've got a climber here, Blush Noisette, which is quite an old variety introduced in the 19th century, and that will eventually grow to completely cover this fence. And it's got this lovely clusters of flowers with an absolutely superb perfume. And just over here is a new English rose, the Dark Lady, with a superb perfume that wafts right over to where I'm sitting. On the fence here is Brother Cadfael. Now that's another English rose, and that's finished its first flowering, but you can see where the buds are forming for the second. And you can also see where I pruned it back when it had finished flowering the last time. It's well worth doing this to try and encourage another flush of flowers later on. And then there's this lovely cottage garden plant, a real old one this, Sweet Rocket or Dame's Violet. That has its best flowering a bit earlier in the season, but it's hung on right till nearly the end of July. And of course that comes in white or in purple, and it has a lovely perfume. Over this side of the garden is my little herb garden, and you have to really pick a little bit of this and smell it to get the full value of the perfume, but of course that's the perfect way to keep the plants in trim too. And don't forget that on my little table here, it's planted up with thymes, and just rub your hand over those and, oh, that's delicious. Now, your gateposts are a real work of art. Where did you actually get the idea for that?
Well, I don't know about ideas yet. I don't know where ideas originate. It's a difficult thing to say, but I think the tiles were off of the old house roof, and I think tile pillars like that I first saw at Great Dixter.
And what gave you the idea of twisting them like this?
I love some of these old chimneys, you know, country house chimneys, twisted, all sorts of shapes, beautiful brickwork.
Must have been quite a job to do, I should think.
Well, the trouble is that they're all Staffordshire stoneware tiles, and they don't absorb moisture, so they tend to float anyway. Also, of course, we've got a problem of keeping vertical.
Yes, sure.
You know, you've got to do a full turn before you can check it.
And where did you find this beautiful gate?
Well, this and its companion actually were lying in the orchard, leaning against the end wall when we came here nearly 40 years ago. They had been used as gates in the old rectory orchard.
And instead of using it as a gate, you've used it as a support for cord and apples. That's brilliant.
Well, it's not too bad. It seems to work. I don't know where we got the idea of cord and apples.
In small gardens, even the most utilitarian objects must be made to look beautiful, whether they're growing in amongst the plants or the plants are growing in them. Pinks and carnations have been grown in pots since Elizabethan times. They used to call them gillyflowers then, which I think is a lovely name. But of course they had exactly the same problems with growing them on heavy soil that we have. So for them, the solution was to grow them in pots of very gritty compost. The only difficulty is that with a lot of pinks and certainly all carnations, they do tend to grow a little bit tall, and so therefore they tend to flop over a bit. So you need a support for them, and the Elizabethans made a very attractive one out of wicker work. Well, if you've got a willow tree growing in your garden that you prune every year, then it should be no problem getting ideal material. But if not, you should be able to buy some from a basket maker, or try the art shop who sell basket making materials. Now, a trained basket maker could make a much better job of it than I can, but I cheat a little bit by using florist's wire, which you can buy just for a few coppers from the florist, and just hold it together like that at the top. And then you need some thinner stuff around the bottom to hold it. That will go around, and that again can be fixed with the florist wire, and it makes quite a firm job, and it will last for several years in actual fact. And you finish up with something like this, which I think looks rather attractive, and it certainly does the job. Now you'll notice that in this garden I've used entirely terracotta pots. Now these are quite expensive, so in the artisan's cottage garden I've looked for other things. Mind you, if you search around the second-hand shops, you can even pick up old terracotta pots very cheaply. I think galvanised iron is a great material for cottage gardens. This bucket is a bit shiny and new at the moment, but once it's weathered down it'll look very attractive. And you could use a mop bucket for an oval shape, and for a bit more variety, how about florist buckets, which come in a variety of sizes. Or of course you can make your own out of wood. This is my version of a Versailles tub, for example, which is very simply made with a wooden framework and a little bit of matching nailed onto it. And you can buy these little acorns in the do-it-yourself shop. And quite honestly, if you can use a saw and a screwdriver, it's very easy to make. You can use all kinds of interesting things for containers. This one, for example, is a sagger, and it's used by potters to protect pots when they go into the kiln. And the potters of old used to use them extensively in their gardens. They come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, and you can still buy them second-hand if you're very lucky, or you can get them new. But the classiest container I've got in my garden is this copper urn. It is, in fact, no more than an old hot water cylinder cut in half, and I bought it from my local plumber for the price of a couple of pints. Next to my hot water cylinder, I hung my version of an auricular theatre. They're really just shelves designed to carry a display of colourful pot plants. Now, these theatres have a fascinating history dating back to the days when home workers like weavers would grow plants for competition. Auriculars, tulips, pinks and several others were called florist's flowers, and they needed a lot of attention. So they were ideal for weavers to grow because they worked at home. Well, home working is coming back, so maybe history will repeat itself. The word florist then had a very different meaning. It meant someone dedicated to creating a perfect flower, and perfection was defined by a strict set of rules for each flower. The auricular, for example, had to consist of perfect concentric circles, each in exact proportion to the one surrounding it. The great Victorian gardener Gertrude Jekyll loved cottage gardens, but she had no time for what she described as the petty tyrannies of the florist, teased and tortured to carry off a prize. Well, I think that's a little bit hard, and there's no doubt that florist flowers have given a lot of people a great deal of pleasure over centuries. But still, it's the plants in the borders that really make a cottage garden. Next week we'll be finding out what the old cottage gardeners grew and how they grew them, and we'll also be looking at some improved versions that are available for our new cottage gardens that they would have given their eye teeth for.
I read somewhere that a cottage garden is the personal statement of someone who's at peace with life.
Alex Pankhurst is an expert in the history of cottage garden plants and has written a book on people with plants named after them, Who Does Your Garden Grow? I asked her what she felt made a garden a cottage garden.
It's more a lack of discipline in one way. You have not to mind things that seed themselves. You have to have a little bit of a jumble, I think, but a slightly organised jumble, because if you let things seed themselves everywhere, you will end up with just one thing, and that'll be the strongest thing.
In a windy garden like this, many plants do seed themselves far and wide. Most, of course, are specially planted, and I noticed a fine clump of different coloured ranunculus.
I bought it just for fun. It was all the rage in the 1700s, and in fact at the end of the 18th century there were 800 varieties available, and it went out of fashion about the middle of the last century, and now it's coming back again. I bought it and planted a couple of plants thinking they wouldn't come through the winter, but they have. They're terrific, so I planted a few more.
But one plant that's been in fashion for ages, and I'm sure always will be, is this one. It's a splendid plant.
Oh yes, bleeding heart, or Dicentra spectabilis. It was introduced in the last century and immediately became a cottage garden favourite, possibly because it doesn't like having its root disturbed, and in cottage gardens it wasn't. No. And they had all sorts of names for it. They called it Lady in the Bath, and Bleeding Heart, and the Lyre plant, and Dutchman's breeches. In Denmark it was known as Heart of a Lieutenant, on the grounds that when you pulled aside the sides of the heart, there is a dancer and a champagne bottle, and that of course is what is in the heart of a lieutenant.
And there's a white version of this too, isn't there?
Yes, a beautiful thing, very, very pure. And that's only, I think, been produced in the last 30 years.
Another plant that has changed quite a bit, really, is the aquilegia, isn't it? Because I suppose the one that's grown most now is the long-spurred hybrids, or the McKenna hybrids. But those old granny's bonnets aren't grown quite so much, are they?
No, and I think it's a pity. We were lucky enough to have quite a few old ones in the garden, and they've seeded themselves about quite unhelped by me, and I think they're very nice. This is a particularly sort of old and crinkly one.
Lovely.
The petals are tremendous.
Do you know what that's called?
No, I've no idea what any of them are called. I think they mix and match as they please. But there is one which has become quite well known in the last few years called Nora Barlow, and that's very different, but it's also an old one.
The great Victorian gardener William Robinson summed up the cottage garden philosophy perfectly. Cottage gardeners, he said, are good to their plots and make them fertile. But there's something more, and it's the absence of any pretentious plan that allows the flowers to tell their story to the heart. And it's the story of the flowers that we'll be telling in this programme. After I'd laid out my new cottage gardens at Barnsdale, came the fun of planting them. And believe me, it really is fun. If you haven't done it before, you might feel a bit daunted about planting the garden. And particularly if you've been reading up about combining colours and putting one plant where it'll complement another. But the lovely thing about cottage gardening is that you can forget all of that. First and foremost, you need to think about putting the plants in where they're going to thrive. So you do need to learn a little bit about them so that you can put the sun lovers in the sun and the shade lovers in the shade. You also need to find out how tall they're going to grow so that you can get the tallest at the back and the shortest at the front, or thereabouts. But the lovely thing is that if you've made a mistake, then you simply move them. And we all do make mistakes, believe me, and this is my classic for this year. Now, when I bought this chrysanthemum, it was sold to me as something that was going to grow about this big, but it's come up to something like 4 feet, so I think I was sold the wrong one. So I need to shift it, and the first thing to do is to make sure that it's really well watered. So that's exactly what I did last night. And now it can be dug out. Now normally I would wait a bit. This plant is just about to come into flower, and I should normally wait until it's finished flowering and then cut it back and all would be well. But it's such a gross mistake and it looks so awful that I want to do it now. I still think that it'll be all right. Now what you need to do is to try and get as big a root ball as you possibly can, but in a restricted space like this, that's not at all easy. But that's, I think, not going to be too bad. That's it, and now it can come out. And now I need to find a new home for it. The back of the border here should be ideal, and then it's just a case of putting the plant in at roughly the same depth, replacing the soil that I dug out, working it well round the root ball, and finally giving it another really good puddling in. And my confidence was well rewarded. In 3 weeks it had recovered and was in full flower. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, it's important to revitalise the soil, and I'm using a bit of good garden compost mixed with a sprinkle of organic fertiliser. And then I can plant these much shorter crocosmia. Crocosmias are Victorian cottage garden flowers, and they're ideal for present-day gardens too. But there are some plants that are even better than those our grandfathers grew. I used to grow lupins, for example, but because they collected their own seed, the strain eventually deteriorated and the plants weren't too good. Well, in the 1930s, a nurseryman called George Russell started selecting and rebreeding the lupins and produced some extremely good plants, the well-known Russell lupins. Well, alas, they eventually started deteriorating too. But now the process has been gone through again, and there are good new varieties available as well. This one is called New Generation Lupins, and they make very superior plants indeed. Cottage garden plants have always been easy to grow and easy to propagate, and there's a very good reason why. The way that cottage garden plants have found their way from garden to garden is by the well-established practice of gardeners giving plants away to their friends, and then they give them to their friends. And believe me, it's still going on. Every time I visited a garden and admired a plant, one's been found for me in a pot, or it's even been dug up from the garden. And if you think that the range of cottage garden plants is limited, you'd be amazed at what some of those gardeners were growing.
That's a good pink cow parsley, isn't it? It's funny, isn't it? When you drive down country lanes, you see a different clone and you think, oh, I must have that. And you either go and gather seed and sow it.
And of course, that's exactly what the old cottage gardeners must have done. But I bet they didn't grow this.
Oh, yes, they did. This plant, I know, has been grown in this area for at least 50 odd years. We've called it Tissenton because it was so, you know, prevalent in that village. It seemed to be a weed everywhere at one time. And I think my grandfather possibly brought it from there. And we've had it in our family well over 50 years.
Absolutely super, isn't it?
It's very late flowering. It doesn't start coming out until May. I think it's very good because it's white, it's clear, it's got good spires on it, and it's definitely a good front of border plant.
In some of the gardens I visited, I did find more modern plants.
I don't think it matters that they're not all old-fashioned, as long as they fit in with the general plan of things and do well.
And ballerina, of course, is a very reliable flower, isn't it?
Yes, it is, but you can see even this one has problems.
Well, most of the modern varieties are actually being bred now for resistance to disease, but this has got very bad black spot, hasn't it? What do you do about it?
I'm afraid I don't do anything about it. I'm against spraying, and I pick off the worst of the leaves and just let the rose cope, basically.
Do you find that it sort of gradually deteriorates?
It does. It becomes totally defoliated by the end of the season, I'm afraid.
So what do you do?
Well, other things grow up around it and hide it eventually.
Over here you have an anthemis, which is in flower when mine has finished. Now, how have you managed that?
Well, this started flowering 6 weeks or so ago, and I cut back as the flowers die. I cut them off and cut the foliage back as well, and that helps to keep the whole thing fresh and replenishing itself.
Now, your garden's absolutely full of real cottage garden plants, Rose. This valerian, of course, is a great favourite, isn't it?
Yes, it is, yes.
Do you find that it seeds all over the place?
Definitely. Yeah, you've only got to look around. It's absolutely everywhere. I used to pull it up, but then I think, no, it's so lovely. Just leave it. Enjoy it.
They always seem to seed themselves in the right places, don't
I
they?
know,
It's kind of
yes, they
funny,
do.
Yeah.
They do.
And you've got another one here. Is that a self-sown?
Yes, it is.
It's Love in a Mist.
Yes.
Another good old cottage favourite.
Yeah, I love it.
And you find too, don't you, with these seed-raised plants, that you get slightly different colours, which
Yes.
is very nice.
Yes.
You've got a quite dark blue one there as well.
Yeah, that's right. And that one's quite pale compared to it.
Do you actually collect the seed from these?
Yes, I do. I just sprinkle them in the borders. I don't sort of sow them into a tray or anything, just sprinkle them along.
Well, just on the top?
Yeah.
And they do all right?
Yes, they do.
When I visited Alex Pankhurst earlier in the season, she was a mine of information about where early cottage gardeners might have got their plants.
And for instance, this spectacular looking thing is a wildflower. It's the double form of our own native sea campion. And somebody must have seen it growing and brought it into gardens, and it's been handed on as cuttings ever since, because it really is quite different from the ordinary wild sort. I grow the ordinary one, and if you compare the difference in the flowers, I mean, you know, this is like a carnation. It's quite
fantastic,
stupendous,
isn't it? But of course, in later cottage gardens, there was much too wide a variety, obviously, to have all come from the wild. So I reckon that many of those originated in the big house.
Yes, I should think they did. I should think some were liberated and others were given as slips and seeds. And then they thrived in cottage gardens, usually because they were left alone. And of course, when the big houses then went over to capability brown type landscapes, the plants were kept safe in cottage gardens.
I can just imagine, actually, the head gardener pocketing a few seed capsules from this plant.
Oh, this, Venus's navelwort. Oh yes, it takes its name actually from the seed, which is a little brown ring, rather like somebody's navel. It's a wildflower that comes from Portugal, and it's been around for about 200 years in this country. And it's very easy just to take the seeds and plant them.
And of course, plants have also always been spread around by means of cuttings too, haven't they?
Oh yes, and this is a cutting that I acquired in the time-honoured fashion by begging a piece off my neighbour. Of course, they're terribly easy to take from slips. You just pull off these little bits like this and plant them. And the great thing is that she's now lost hers, but I shall be able to give it back to her, which is very satisfying.
Hannah Hutchinson, in her wonderful cottage garden on the Isle of Wight, is another gardener happy to let nature do some of her planting for her.
Well, they're the very commoner garden, Forget-Me-Not, Sutton's Royal Blue, and I let them seed themselves every year. And it makes a lovely mass of colour, as you say.
A beautiful old cottage garden plants, isn't it? And at the back of that is that purple plant. Now that's honesty, isn't it?
Honesty, that's right, lunaria. It seeds itself as the forget-me-nots do, and I just let it ramp.
Because that's been grown in cottage gardens for really centuries.
Generations, yes, yes. And there is a white one, and Carter's used to do a very deep purple one, but I haven't seen it around lately.
Now you've got a border here which is full of self-seeding plants, lots of herbaceous plants and a few shrubs. Is it an expensive thing to do?
No, not really, because I grow the majority of things from seed. I do buy in, if I go to a plant sale or a nursery, I select rather special things. But the ordinary things like the phlox and the lupins and the daisy plants, I grow all from seed.
All the cottage gardeners I visited propagated their own plants. They had many different techniques, and I did find that in small gardens without a greenhouse, the windowsill was invaluable. For some, a green-fingered instinct proved more valuable than knowledge.
One of my favourites is clematis. And if I'd known in the beginning that you're supposed to have mist propagators and all these fancy things, then I'd probably never have started. But as it happened, I'd already succeeded before I found out you needed all this stuff. So I just have a plant pot and a plastic bag, held on with an elastic band, nice cutting inside, and that's it. In a few weeks, rooted.
That bag doesn't touch the leaves at all. How do you inflate it?
Concealed in here. Piece of very expensive equipment, one drinking straw inside the bag. Greenhouse.
That is absolutely brilliant, isn't it? Wonderful.
It
but
works.
You don't have any plastic bags over the geraniums?
No, I don't, because they don't need them. I think they prefer drier conditions. I think they'd be likely to go all soft and rotten if they had a plastic bag over them.
What sort of success rate do you get?
With the clematis, probably around about 70%, which I think is pretty good. The geraniums, probably more, 90%.
All I do is take one or two of the main leaves, like that, and put them straight into a pot. And it doesn't seem to demand anything else other than a spray of water, and with a matter of weeks we've got little plantlets coming out of there, and that's quite easy in a cold house.
I'm very keen on propagating slowly in cold frame. Of course, we don't do everything that way, but you have to be patient, but it means you get wonderful rooting systems and very good plants.
Yes, you've got a tremendous number of plants here. And looking at the equipment, it looks as though anybody could make it.
Of course, yes. I mean, you could adapt the idea in all sorts of ways. And I started originally with a wooden box with a pane of glass, and at one stage I had 2 frames with old windows out of the cottage.
And what do you actually root them into?
Johniness, number 1, sometimes seed, and a lot of grit, some horticultural silver sand, just a touch of peat, but not very much. The drainage is very important, because if you get a very wet winter, which we've just had, you can have water lying. Of course, if they're sitting in water for a time, they're going to die.
Now, the frames are uncovered at the moment.
Yes.
When do you cover them?
I do the cuttings in September. Early September I start until the middle of October, and we don't put the lids on at all probably until we're into November, just at night time. And then when the weather closes down, by the end of November, they're on day and night. We hardly peep at them at all. And then when February comes, if we get nice bright days with the wind, you know, with the air moving nicely, we lift them off altogether in the daytime, but still close them at night and cover them at night with sacks if we get extreme conditions.
And Carol, are these your tools?
Those are my getting out tools. Yes, when things are ready, I do a long line down between the rows, both sides, and then I cut them out like little cubes, really.
And in those simple ways, flowers like these have been propagated and grown for generations. I love those simple old cottage garden flowers, but you know, here and there we can actually do better than the old cottage gardeners. And we'd be silly not to take advantage of those modern developments. Now, roses are a perfect example. The old-fashioned roses had that wonderful cabbagey look, but many of them had the disadvantage that they would only flower once during the season. Well, now, the old-fashioned ones have been carefully crossed with modern perpetual flowering varieties, and the result is a rose with the old-fashioned cabbagey look that flowers right the way through the season. I reckon, Pat, that we can actually make better cottage gardens now than the old original cottages could, because we've got improved plants, really, haven't we?
Well, that's right, yes. This is one of them. This is Nepeta Six Hills Giant, which is a much better plant than the ordinary old Fascinia, I think it was called. This is much bigger and more colourful and goes on flowering for months.
And there's a shrub here which can be grown as a small tree as well, which can't have been available for more than, I suppose, about 10 years.
No, probably not. In fact, that's only about 6 years old. But I keep it small by constantly cutting it back in order to get the new young growth, which is the pink and cream colouring, and it stops it getting too big for the border as well.
This is an exciting new introduction from America, which I'm sure the old cottage gardeners would have loved. It's a new verbena, and it'll give you purple flowers right the way through the summer. Now, most verbenas, generally speaking, are only hardy in the warmer counties, but this one is said to be bone hardy almost anywhere. Got to be worth a try. Alex, tell me about this lavender.
Ah, now that is a new form of French lavender. It's only appeared, as far as I know, in the last few years, and it's much bigger and better than the previous sort. I mean, it's much taller, and it has these lovely long ears which carry on blooming for a very long time.
Is it hardy?
Well, it's supposed to be more tender than the ordinary sort, but I've had mine for 4 years now, and I've had no trouble with it at all. I think it's quite a tough customer.
Of course, you do have the right soil for it here,
Oh
don't you?
yes, very dry. Of course, all lavenders like dry soil.
With this variegated Jacob's ladder, there's an interesting twist. This has just been introduced on the market, and yet there are records of it having been grown as early as the 18th century, and then it seemed to completely disappear. It's been recently found again in a nursery in France and reintroduced over here, and jolly nice it is too. It's got flowers very much like the normal Jacob's ladder, but I'd grow it just for that lovely variegated foliage. One group of plants even Victorian gardeners wouldn't have had many of are the tender perennials. But I think they're extremely good cottage garden plants because they fit all the criteria. They have simple flowers, they're easy to grow, and they're easy to propagate. So never be put off growing them in your new cottage garden just because they're tender. Things like the osteospermums, for example, are quite superb and will go on flowering right the way through the summer. Now, some of these are hardy, but a lot depends on where you live. So it's always worthwhile taking cuttings during the late summer, and they really are very easy to root in a bit of coir compost and grow on over the winter on the windowsill. And then you'll have a really good insurance policy just in case you get a hard frost. You can do the marguerites or argyranthemums in exactly the same way, and again they'll go on flowering the whole season long. I certainly wouldn't want to be without the penstemons. Now, quite a few of these are actually hardy, but not all. And a good rule of thumb is that the ones with the bigger leaves are the ones that are likely to be more tender. So again, it's well worthwhile taking cuttings from these anyway. Things like the hardy salvias can be raised from seed. This is Salvia patens, and that comes very easily from seed, so of course you can get hundreds of plants every year from just one. If you've got a nice, dry, sunny spot, you can't do better than the South African diaceas. These will go on flowering right the way through the summer. In fact, young plants of these can actually flower themselves to death. So if you've just planted one, it's a good idea to cut it back about the end of August time to get it established before the winter. Now, one plant that the Victorian gardeners certainly would have had were the dahlias, but they didn't have anything like the range and the colours and the shapes and the sizes we've got today.
So would the great Victorian gardener William Robinson have used these improved plants? His own garden is now the grounds of a private hotel and had been allowed to decline, but it has now been recreated in his spirit.
We have obviously introduced more plants as they've become available because we feel that the garden is not a museum piece to Robinson, but rather it is a moving historical reminder of what he did, and he was very much a plant collector and introduced things as they came.
And of course he influenced people like Gertrude Jekyll, who was a contemporary, quite a lot, didn't he?
They were friends, but I think also perhaps rivals too. I'd like to think that, like most gardeners, that they put their heads together and discuss things, and who actually sort of put pen to paper first or came out with the idea in the first place is a sort of bone of contention. He liked to imitate nature as far as possible, so he liked things to look natural and not contrived, and so he followed the philosophy of imitating what he saw around him.
How did he get his ideas over?
He was a very prolific writer, journalist. He edited 2 magazines, one called The Garden, the other Cottage Gardening. I think he was trying to get across ideas of how people might improve their current way of gardening. They didn't need to put in so much labour. They didn't need to rip out beds twice a year and put in bedding. They could have permanent plantings, and that he was trying to put that idea across.
Cottage Gardening was not just a magazine about the aesthetics of the garden. It contained a mass of practical information about ornamental borders, but also about other subjects dear to the country gardener's heart. Bees, poultry, and of course vegetables. And that's the subject of next week's programme, the cottage economy. In both my cottage gardens at Barnsdale, I have followed in the slightly muddy footsteps of my predecessors and included many productive plants. But if you want your borders filled with flowers but your garden small, then you won't have a lot of room for vegetables. And I suppose that a small plot like this doesn't really do justice to the old cottage garden principle. Alas, real cottage gardens where they grew flowers and enough produce for the extended family are few and far between. And even fewer are the real old cottage gardeners whose heads and hands are ingrained with that old rural wisdom that's been handed down through generations of countrymen. Some of the gardeners I met have provided me with a special inspiration. 87-year-old retired farm worker George Flatt well remembers his younger days when his garden was essential for survival. It's still much as it was then, but it's anything but solely utilitarian. Well, it's midsummer now, George. You've been busy, haven't you?
Well, I keep doing, you know, every day. I have an hour or two, and then go and sit down and have a little rest.
Is most of this stuff self-set, or do you
Oh, yes,
sow?
no, that's all set there, you know. That's come every year.
Yeah. You got some good old hollyhocks over there.
Yes, they've been in there several years, you know.
And they keep seeding themselves, do they?
Well, I think how the old ones keep coming, you know, every year. Yeah, there is some young ones come up. Of course, I had to do away with some of them, you know, there's too many.
What about things like the Gadisha?
That's just the same as that, you see. They've been all over the garden.
That's a hardy annual, isn't it? So it seeds itself,
Yes, I do, yeah.
It's really, really
That's
great.
ever so pretty, though. There's so many different colours, I don't know. Well, there's some there, look. Some nice colours in, ain't there?
What about the gladioli? Now, you must buy those.
No, I don't. I ain't bought any nut for years. Well, I just take them up and harvest them, you know, and then clean them up and set them again.
You store them over the winter in the house?
Yes.
You've got quite a lot of vegetables up at the end there. You don't worry about putting vegetables in with flowers?
No, I don't trouble them out, no. Yeah. Well, that's just a bit of spare ground I'd got, you see, and I thought, well, I'll put the plants in there.
Yeah. George has an old country experience you won't find in modern textbooks. The common problem of slugs in potatoes, for example, never bothers him.
I've got slugs here. I get in the potatoes, you see, if I don't look after them.
So what do you do?
When I plant the potatoes, look, I put the farmyard manure in, then the potato, then I cover it with soot. I took them potatoes up, I ain't had one slug eating one.
Well, for me, that's almost a good enough reason to take out the central heating.
You mustn't put new soot, you know what I mean. Not right new on, let it be a year old. That's the best way.
Yeah.
If that was right new, I'd have to burn the shoots off potatoes, you see.
George grows much more produce than he could possibly use himself.
People have it, you see, my relations come and they have it and they freeze it and do all that sort of work, you see.
And then
same as the plums and black currants and gooseberries, and they take all them, then they'll bring me a pie back, you see.
Why don't you freeze it yourself?
Well, I no need to. I mean, I can go out and get fresh vegetables every day.
I adapted one of George's bits of improvisation for my own artisan's garden, though I tried to make it a bit more sophisticated. If you want to raise your own seedlings, but you've only got the windowsill to do it on, then you'll find a cold frame is invaluable. You can start off all your early vegetables, you can grow your own bedding plants, and a bit later on you can grow all sorts of cuttings in here too. And it isn't an expensive job. The sides are made with floorboards, and if you buy them second-hand from the demolition contractor, they're really very cheap indeed. Now, the tops are made with old windows, and you can very often find those at the replacement window contractors. Now, his job is to take old windows out of houses and to put new ones in, and the old ones he very often throws away. So I got mine for nothing. But remember that you've got to really build the frame to fit the windows, so get those first. Now, I've used mine for raising early vegetable plants, and I'm going to put those out here in my tiny vegetable plot.
Now, I'm growing the vegetables here on a raised bed, and that, I'm quite sure, is the best way to get the most amount of vegetables out of the smallest amount of space. Because you've got no access paths in between the rows and all the work is done from the side, you can really cram them in. And because the soil is raised and edged with these boards, that improves the drainage, warms up the soil, and you get them earlier too. In the gentleman's garden, I've got the luxury of a bit more space and a lot more money. So here I've allowed myself a vegetable plot, but I've raised the beds here using these lovely Victorian edging tiles. Now, they're not as expensive as you might think, and I bought them in a place that first started making these things in the 14th century, so I simply couldn't resist. Now, I've raised these a bit earlier too, because here, again, I've got a greenhouse. Now, the greenhouse is hexagonal, because that's absolutely ideal for a small garden. You can fit it more or less into any corner. The old cottage gardeners would have had to make use of every square inch of land they could. And my goodness, nothing much has changed today. In order to get the most out of our small vegetable plots, we've got to resow or plant every piece of land as soon as it becomes available. I've just harvested radishes and lettuces from this piece of land, and now it's the turn of the runner beans. Even if you live in the city, use hazel poles to give the country effect. I'm using them to support the variety Painted Lady, which has lovely red and white flowers, so as well as producing delicious beans, it looks good too. On my second visit to George Flatt, I was able to enjoy the peas I'd seen him sowing last time. Have you had much off these?
Oh yeah, I had several dinners off there.
Yeah. Tastes lovely. Nothing like fresh peas.
Nice pea. Now, you see that?
What variety are they, George?
Green sleeve drawn. But I don't think you can go buy them now.
Do you collect the seed then?
I did do, yes. I get the seed every year, yes. Most of them I got iodine. 2, 4, 6 or 7 in there. Yeah, I had a lot with iodine. I think that's about the most. That lovely pea.
Yeah.
Ever so sweet.
Well, you've got a row of peas over here, George, that are going a bit brown. Are they for collecting seed from too?
Yes, I should save some seed off them. I can put them in the winter time, you see, and then they'll come early.
What are they then?
Bird's eye. What they grow in the fields, you know that.
Oh, they grow them for canning?
Yeah, that's right.
Freezing.
Any day now I shall pull them up, you see. And
then what will you do with them?
Just rub them out and get the seed out and save for another year.
Yeah. You've got an onion over there as well, a few onions that are going to seed too.
Oh yes, that's growing them for seed.
George's garden overflows with everything from onions to soft fruit. If you want to grow bumper crops of fruit and vegetables, it's essential to maintain fertility. Now, the old cottage gardeners would have had the manure from their pigs and their chickens. You might not be able to do that, but one thing you can do is to keep a compost heap. Now, every garden should really have 2 compost heaps, one to rot down while the other one's filling up. But the trouble is that in a small garden you can see everything, so even the compost container has to be attractive. Well, another thing the old cottagers did was to keep bees in very beautiful beehives. So why not combine the two and make a novel compost container? Mine consists of 5 frames like this, which are simply screwed together and they fit neatly one on top of the other. And the top is made with feather edge fencing. Most old cottage gardens had a beehive or two, but they didn't contain compost.
As we were filming in this garden today, we were suddenly interrupted by a huge swarm of bees. So he promptly took cover inside the house and did, as you should always do on these occasions, phoned the local beekeeper. Well, the bees swarmed all round the windows and eventually found their way under the thatch and into the attic. And by the time Ron Rackett and his friend Barry arrived, it seemed that there was little they could do. The bees settled in the attic and may remain there for several years. But Hannah Hutchinson, who lives there, was reassured to learn that they would leave her well alone. I took advantage of the occasion to visit Ron in his own garden and find out how I could start to learn about beekeeping.
You've got to start off in May. That's when the queens start to lay. The first year, you'll get up to £40 of honey.
Really?
But the second year, you increase your brood to a brood and a half. You're talking 90 to 100,000 bees. And out of that brood and a half, on a good summer, you could top up to £80 of honey per hive.
And are there any special plants that are really good for bees?
They don't like daffodils. Crocuses, they love crocuses,
really?
Which is how we say March.
What else do you think they go for?
Well, the most popular one, if you've got a big enough one, will be the buddleia. They really love that. Catnip, lavender is great.
And will they actually improve the garden?
Yes, definitely. 2 months ago, when we lost our hives through the Bowmora, this garden and my neighbours was dead. There was no bees whatsoever. The apple trees have hardly got any apples on. It was like there's no life left for us. You know, it's dead. Everything's dead round the corner. But now you can sit up there in the evening and see the bees going in and out.
Well, you obviously love your bees, Ron. Do you talk to them?
Yes, you've got to talk to them. If any of the member of the family dies, you should go down and, this is going to sound silly, tap the hive 3 times and tell the bees who died. Bees are wonderful things. You learn a lot from bees. I don't eat honey, can't stand the stuff. Although I have 2 spoonfuls of sugar in my tea, but I will not eat honey. Ooh, it's terrible stuff, too sweet. But I'm allergic to bee stings. Why do I do it, you ask me? I don't know. I enjoy it. It's as good as working.
Bees do a vital job in pollinating flowers and particularly fruit.
Crab apples have been grown in cottage gardens since the earliest times, and it's not difficult to see why. For a start, they have flowers that lift the spirits in the spring, and they're followed by very attractive fruits in the autumn. And of course, those fruits too you can eat. Now, the cottage gardeners use those for making things like crab apple jelly, and for jams and preserves and wine too. And of course, we can do exactly the same thing today. Now, of course, those old crab apples would have been pretty big trees, and much too big, really, for our small gardens. But that's one way where we can do a bit better than the old cottage gardeners did, because all crab apples these days, and indeed apples, are grafted onto special rootstocks that keep them nice and small. And so they're ideal for small gardens like ours. Now, you can actually see the rootstock down at the bottom of the plant there, and that's the variety on the top. And it's absolutely essential not to bury that rootstock too deeply, because if you do that, the top of the plant will root into the ground, and of course then you're back to the situation the old cottage gardeners had of having a very vigorous tree.
Fruit trees are quite reasonably priced, but George Flatt, like many cottagers of old, had an even cheaper way.
Well, I just grew it from a pip, you see.
Did you really?
Yeah. My mother always used to pack me an apple and an orange up for my dinner. And of course I thought it was a lovely apple, I'll save the pip. So I got the pips and brought them home, put them in a flower pot, and that's how I managed to get that.
And what's the apple like?
It was a lovely apple. Yes, it's a nice apple.
What's the variety?
Oh, you don't know, you see. My paper from just across the way there, she come over and she said, I was a gathering of them, you see, and she said, lovely apple. She said, can I have one? I said, well, of course you can. I said, you can have an apple. She said, what do you call them? I said, I don't know. I said, I ain't got a name. She said, well, I'll name that. She said, George is special.
The French were the great experts in training fruit trees, and they used to grow apples and pears in particular into some most extraordinary shapes. But it's the flat shapes that really interest us, like the fans, because they take up such a small amount of room. Now, they were enthusiastically taken up by gentlemen gardeners, but the cottagers were a bit reluctant earlier on. But certainly they're very valuable for us. Now, if you haven't got a fence to train them up or a wall, erect a post and wire structure like this and tie some canes to it in the shape of a fan and train the branches onto those canes. And you should also take advantage of the growth habit of the tree. The fact is that if a branch is growing straight up, it will grow much more vigorously. And as it is pulled down like this, it grows less vigorously but produces more fruit. So in the early stages, where you've got weak shoots like this, you grow those for the first year or so straight up the cane, and then later on that will be pulled right down to here to take its proper place on the fan to produce a very beautiful and productive tree. If you're lucky enough to have a wall, you can grow fruit against that. A south-facing wall benefits pears in particular because they need sun and warmth for perfect crops.
This wall is due south and it's a brick lined onto stone so that the wall will actually absorb the heat and help to ripen the pears later on.
So you've got a real storage heater effect, but I suppose you could do much the same sort of thing on a fence, couldn't you?
I don't see why not, provided the fence is good and strong, because pears are very heavy fruits.
Yeah. Well, what really amazes me is that you've got so many pears here in such a small space. How many varieties are there?
I think I've got about a dozen varieties, so that means I've got 24 cordons on this wall.
How far apart are they planted?
They're approximately 2'6" apart, so they're quite close.
Now, a lot of people are put off by the difficulties of pruning cordons like these, but it's not actually a hard job, is it?
I think it's a lot easier than pruning a normal fruit tree.
And of course you do them in the summer, don't you? A little bit earlier than apples?
Yes, I reckon about the early part of August is ideal. And the reason for that is you need to have the shoots ready to ripen the fruit buds for the following year. And by reducing them then, they've got a chance to ripen off.
And what exactly do you do?
Well, what I like to do is to cut back each shoot to approximately 3 to 4 buds.
And of course, every cottage garden should grow soft fruit too. The old cottage gardeners were very enthusiastic about gooseberries, and they've grown them since about the 17th century. But as far as I know, they never grew standard gooseberries. So here's another way that we can get one up on them. Because if you grow a standard gooseberry, of course, you can save all that valuable space underneath and grow something else there as well. It should be planted up against a strong stake because they crop very well, these plants, and they do need a bit of support. And then you put a handful of organic fertiliser over the soil that you've dug out, and then just push that in, firm it down, and that should do well. Now, the one problem with gooseberries is that they don't like root disturbance, so you don't want to be digging round them all the time. So the answer is to plant straight away, right up against them, something which is permanent. We'll just form a nice little bed right round the plant. I'm using this Santolina, which will be planted right up against the gooseberry, and that will form a nice little mound of foliage right the way around, and I won't have to disturb it. Now the very final job is to support the gooseberry really well. So you want a couple of rose ties here, making sure that you've got the spacer in between the plant and the stake. One at the top and one halfway down. And then you've got a place in the garden which is productive and looks beautiful too.
As well as fruit and vegetables, the old cottagers raised animals too, and a few chickens really are a great asset.
Now you can buy a little pen like this for 4 chickens, or it's quite easy to make one yourself. And in the vegetable garden, as soon as you've cleared a piece of land, you put the chickens on it. They'll eat up all your soil pests, they'll scratch around and eat up the weed seeds too. They'll recycle all your vegetable waste into really good manure and fertiliser. And just as a little bonus, they'll lay your breakfast egg for you too.
Another cottage garden must were herbs. Lynn Rayner is following a family tradition.
My grandmother used to grow herbs. She always used to talk about herbal medicine and how they used to use it in the old days, and she always used to have bunches of herbs hanging, drying in a kitchen, and there was a characteristic smell with it that always, you know, it brings that time back to me. And when I got my first home, I wanted to grow a herb garden, and you couldn't buy the herbs in garden centres at the time, so I took to growing my own from seed, and really the collection started from there, literally. Not only were they useful, but they were simple, they were beautiful, they attracted the bees, the butterflies, the wildlife, and it all seemed to come together somehow.
Yeah, but do you actually use this bit of the garden?
The roses are used in the potpourris, and we also have some medicinal plants on this bank as well, such as this one. This is the poke root, that's the North American Indian word for it, Phytolacca americana. That was used and is used for rheumatic conditions and is very effective.
Just at the back there, you've got borage. I grow borage, and I grow it because it's one of the loveliest herbs of all, I think.
Yes.
And seeds itself all over the place. But I don't drink a lot of Pim's number 1, so what do I do with it?
Well, we use it in salad, really. The flowers are edible, and they're so pretty, and the thing to do is to take one off, and if you just get hold of the black bit in the centre and pull the back off, it comes away very nicely. And then very carefully ease away the middle, and that in a salad bowl it looks beautiful and it tastes beautiful also. And it's really big business in the catering industry now.
Now this is southern wood, isn't it?
That's
What's
right.
that used for?
Well, it can be used as a rinse for dark hair. It makes dark hair shine, and also it can be dried as a moth repellent in wardrobes. But actually my father-in-law was a Yorkshireman, once told me that when they went courting, they used to put a piece in the lapel like that, and when they met the lady, they would say, smell that, and she would bend down to smell it, and as she bent down they would kiss.
Oh,
which is
lovely.
quite a nice story.
And that's why it's called lad's-love.
That's right.
Well, you raise a lot of stuff yourself, I know, from cuttings, obviously, and a lot from seed, which is cheap. But you've got a fantastic border here, which must have cost you no more than a few pounds.
That's right, yes. It's very inexpensive if you raise everything from seed, or, as you say, do cuttings yourself.
All hardy annuals?
That's right, yes. The Viper's Bugloss is a biennial. But
Yes, that's lovely, isn't it, the Viper's
It is. It's a native wildflower, but you don't see it around very much
No,
these
it's a great
days.
shame, isn't it?
It is, because it's superb.
And I grow this ladybird poppy myself.
Yes.
I'm besotted with that.
I know, it's wonderful, isn't it? Yeah, how do they get the black spots in the middle of the
Well, I don't know.
Over the past year, I've been visiting wonderful cottage gardens and coming back to Barnsdale fired up with even greater enthusiasm. So, all I need now for my new cottage gardens to become as mouth-watering as the old ones we've seen is a bit of growth. And fortunately, that's something that nature will do for me. The truth is that in cottage gardening, it's nature who's the real artist. All we have to do is to behave like a sort of umpire just to make sure that we get the results that we want. Now, of course, it does take a bit of time, but believe me, every minute you spend in a garden like this is pure, unadulterated joy. Now, as I've admitted, the gentleman's garden is expensive. For me, it's the sort of thing that we all eventually aspire to. But once you get started, it doesn't have to take very long. Remember that I started planting this just 5 months ago. The artisan's garden is a year older, but I suppose this is the one that I've enjoyed building the most. Just like the countrymen of old, you have to use your ingenuity here, and you have to master a few basic do-it-yourself skills. But if you can use a saw, a hammer and a spade, well, you're home and dry. And do bear in mind that all of these plants can be easily propagated from seed or cuttings. So all you have to do is to cultivate a few gardening friends, and just like the cottagers of old, you can fill your garden with plants for next to nothing. Just remember the words of wise old William Robinson. Be kind to your plot, keep it fertile, and let the flowers tell their story to the heart.